Why was everyone laughing except her? The sun over Coronado was merciless, baking the asphalt until it shimmered like a mirage. The grinder, the legendary courtyard of pain where candidates were broken and remade, smelled faintly of salt water, sweat, and old leather boots. It was a place where respect wasn't given, it was taken, clawed out of sand and surf, earned with blisters and bone-deep exhaustion. Yet on this day, in this sacred arena of toughness, the laughter wasn't from triumph. It was ridicule. Looks like someone's little sister got lost on her way to the commissary. The words came from Senior Chief Rex Callahan, his voice carrying the cutting authority of someone who ruled this patch of ground like a feudal lord. Arms crossed over a chest built like a wall, he smirked at the figure standing before him. The grinder, sweetheart, isn't a yoga class. Go find your real clothes before you get hurt. The crowd of young candidates, nervous, buzzing with adrenaline and desperation to belong, snickered on cue. It wasn't so much genuine humor as it was survival instinct. Align with the loudest voice, the man in charge, and maybe you'd avoid his wrath. Their laughter clattered across the deck like brass casings hitting concrete. But the target of their scorn didn't flinch. She stood still, smaller than most of them, dressed in plain PT shorts and a gray t-shirt that looked borrowed, her hair pulled back in a functional ponytail. No badge of rank on display. No weapon. No armor. Just a quiet woman in running gear. Her face betrayed nothing. Her eyes, gray, steady, unreadable, absorbed the insults like water soaking into sand. She didn't smirk, didn't frown, didn't so much as blink faster. That silence unsettled the air. It wasn't the silence of fear, not of someone cornered or crushed. It was the kind of silence that consumed sound itself, a void where barbs and ridicule went to die. And from the observation deck above, Captain Elias Thorne noticed. To most, she looked like a misplaced bureaucrat, a desk officer caught in the wrong world. To him, her stance told a different story, feet shoulder-width apart, weight perfectly balanced, shoulders loose yet ready, the posture of someone who didn't need noise to command space. Thorne leaned forward, his jaw tightening. That stance was a signature, a language written in muscle memory. He'd seen it before, years ago, in places where silence was life and hesitation was death. Down on the grinder, Callahan pressed. He saw weakness where there was none. He saw a chance to make an example. You can't participate in the dive evolution dressed for a jogathon, ma'am. He let the honorific drip with sarcasm. Safety regulations. You understand. His words echoed like an order to leave. His meaning was clear. You don't belong, walk away. She nodded once, just once, a small, sharp motion, then her voice flat as steel on stone. Understood, Senior Chief. And she turned, though not toward the exit. The candidates shifted, whispering. They expected retreat. They expected a quiet walk of shame. The Senior Chief's smirk deepened. He believed he'd won. He believed silence meant surrender. Calm meant weakness. It was the oldest mistake arrogance ever made. She walked toward the lockers. Not hers, surely, they thought. What could be inside but spare running shoes or a paperback? Nothing that belonged in this world. The metallic slam of the locker door opening cracked through the courtyard. The sound froze the whispers. Heads turned. What emerged wasn't a towel, not a jacket, not the meek exit they anticipated. The first glint of black caught their eyes, the sheen of a dry suit. Not the thick, standard-issue training ones hanging in racks nearby, but a custom-fitted low-profile combat model. Matte black, designed to slip through dark water unseen. Then came the plate carrier, bristling with gear, arranged not haphazardly, but in a pattern only muscle memory explains. Pouches in places only experience could dictate. Tools worn by use, not by vanity. And then she pulled out the rebreather. A Dredger LARV closed circuit, bubble-free, the weapon of ghosts in the ocean. The laughter died in an instant. Callahan's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second before he forced it back. but the crack had appeared. One by one she kitted up, each motion economical, fluid, the rhythm of someone who had done this ritual 1,000 times before. Dry suit pulled tight, valves checked, gauges tapped, straps cinched, knife on the calf, weighted belt on the hips, blue inert training rifle slung smooth across her back. Every second was deliberate, every second screamed competence. By the time she lowered her mask and clipped the breathing unit into place, the transformation was complete. The small, plain woman in running clothes had vanished. In her place stood a silhouette cut from the ocean's abyss itself. Predatory, silent, inevitable. She turned, masked, unreadable, but her nod toward Callahan was unmistakable. The demonstration had begun. The pool loomed before her, the serpent's tooth, a labyrinth beneath the water, pipes, wires, tunnels, entanglement nets, claustrophobia weaponized, panic manufactured. It had broken countless candidates before. It had records held by legends, untouchable by mortals. She didn't pause, didn't test the water. She slipped in. The surface swallowed her. And for a moment, there was silence again, until the monitors flickered to life. Her form beneath the water was startling. She didn't fight the current, didn't thrash. She became part of it, moving with a grace that belonged less to a trainee and more to an apex predator. Every kick, every shift of buoyancy precise. No wasted motion. The first pipe system swallowed her whole. Candidates watching clenched their jaws, imagining themselves stuck, choking on panic in the dark. But she moved through like liquid itself, sliding with impossible efficiency. Callahan hit the timer with a theatrical jab. Cynicism etched on his face. He expected her to fail, to surface gasping, to give him another punchline. But as she disappeared deeper into the serpent's tooth, his cynicism began to erode. Because what was happening on those monitors didn't make sense. The candidates leaned forward, caught in the glow of the screens. For the first time that day, no one laughed. And Callahan, arms still crossed, chest still broad, felt something unfamiliar creep into the cracks of his certainty. Doubt. How long could a single breath of silence last? The monitors above the pool glowed pale green, ghostly in the humid air. Every eye clung to them, even the ones that had laughed seconds earlier. The grainy images showed her form gliding through the maze of the serpent's tooth, a figure so calm, so fluid. She looked almost alien compared to the thrashing, panicked movements usually caught on those cameras. She didn't push, she didn't fight, she moved. Subtle adjustments, tiny tilts of her fins, shifts of her shoulders. It was artistry underwater, not frantic but deliberate, not survival but mastery. One of the trainees muttered under his breath, voice cracking with disbelief. She's not even trying. And maybe that was what chilled them most. It didn't look like effort, it looked like memory. Through the narrow tunnel of steel piping, where most candidates scraped skin or lost their orientation, she passed without a hitch. The confined space seemed to embrace her, as though she belonged in places designed to choke others. Callahan's hand hovered near his stopwatch, thumb tense. He kept his smirk, but his jaw ticked with each second. He wanted her to surface, to cough, to choke, to fail. That was the rhythm he understood. Instead, she accelerated. At the entanglement net, where cords and ropes wrapped around gear, catching fins and regulators, she paused only for a fraction of a second. Most candidates wrestled here, panic clawing at their throats as seconds bled away. But she went still. Limbs slack, body floating for just an instant, like a puppet with cut strings. It was disconcerting, too calm. Then, like a surgeon finding a vein, she moved. One deliberate slice of her blade, one twist of her shoulder. A pull, a push, a slide. The ropes fell away. She was free. The crowd around the pool inhaled as one. The monitors flickered with her steady progress. She wasn't fighting the serpent's tooth. She was dissecting it. But the test wasn't finished. In the adjacent lane, a trainee fought for air. Young, strong, but unraveling. His movements screamed panic, wild kicks, clawing hands, regulator knocked loose. He tangled himself in guide wires, limbs jerking with growing desperation. The red distress light above the pool snapped on, bathing the control panel in warning glow. Callahan barked into his microphone, summoning safety divers. The system worked like clockwork. Spot a drowning trainee, deploy rescue. Only the system wasn't fast enough. Before the divers even hit the water, her form changed course. The candidates gasped, the instructors leaned forward, even Thorne froze on the deck. She swam toward the flailing shadow with steady, inexorable strokes. No wasted urgency, no panic, just purpose. Her hand gripped the boy's harness, stabilizing him with the kind of force that steadies chaos. With her other hand, she pressed his regulator back into his mouth, sealed it, purged it. Then methodically, without rush, she cleared the wires that trapped him, each tug precise, each motion saving not just his dive but his life. The boy's thrashing stilled. His limbs, frantic seconds ago, softened. She pressed his shoulder, guided him toward a safe alcove lit faintly by emergency strobes. He clung there, wide-eyed, as if he'd seen death itself retreat. And just like that, she left him. Not a second wasted, not a glance backward. She returned to her lane, returned to her mission. The room was silent. You could hear boots shifting, hear the whisper of water dripping from pipes, hear the creak of Callahan's jaw tightening. The timer still ran, and she was already moving again. Through the last stretch of the Serpent's tooth, her form grew sharper, faster. Where exhaustion should have slowed her, precision drove her. She touched the final plate, surfaced in one motion, mask breaking water. The sound of her breathing apparatus filled the room, steady, calm, like nothing extraordinary had happened. But the silence that greeted her was deafening. Every pair of eyes snapped to the digital clock. The numbers glared back. Her time wasn't just better. It wasn't just a new record. It was obliteration, 2 full minutes faster than the base record held for nearly a decade. A record thought untouchable. It was as if someone had cracked the sky open and rewritten the laws of possibility. "That's not possible," Callahan's voice leaked out, hushed, stripped of authority. He wasn't the only one who couldn't believe it. The trainees stared like children watching a ghost walk through a wall. Some shifted uneasily, shame pressing heavy against their ribs. Their laughter hours ago already felt like a sin. Up on the observation deck, Captain Thorne didn't move. His eyes, fixed on the woman in the water, flickered with recognition. He knew that stance, that precision, that silence. And in his chest, memory ignited. He descended the stairs. Each metallic step rang like a gavel, cutting through the stunned quiet. By the time his boots struck the pool deck, the atmosphere had shifted. Even the air felt thicker. The woman, still stripping off her rebreather with the same measured calm she had used putting it on, didn't look up. Her mask came off, her gloves peeled away. No theatrics, no victory smile, just deliberate professional motion. She was not performing for them. She was being herself. Thorne didn't go to Callahan. He went to the small, secure terminal by the dive master's station. His fingers tapped out a code with practiced certainty. The monitor glowed, pulling up a secure database, Naval Special Warfare's beating heart of names and records. He typed hers. The file opened. And for the first time in years, Elias Thorne inhaled sharply. The name, the assignments, the accolades, it all crashed through him. When he turned, his expression wasn't awe. It wasn't pride. It was gravity, the weight of a truth no one else yet understood. He faced the deck, faced Callahan, faced the trainees who had laughed. "You asked this officer to find her real clothes," he said, his voice low but cutting through the silence like a blade. "You assumed she was a tourist in your world." Callahan's face went pale. Thorne let the pause linger, let it hurt. Then his voice rose, not loud but with the authority of someone who didn't need to shout to command. Lieutenant Commander Maya Sorensen, Special Activities Division DEVGRU, formerly SEAL Team 3, 5 combat deployments, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, a Purple Heart. The litany of medals hit the deck like hammer strikes, each syllable heavier than the last. Around the pool, shoulders slumped, heads bowed. They hadn't mocked a pencil pusher. They hadn't mocked a staff officer. They had mocked a legend. Thorne turned toward her, and in that moment, something shifted that none of the men had ever seen before. He straightened to full height, his spine locked like steel, and he saluted. Not the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. This was different. This was reverence. This was acknowledgement from one warrior to another. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice steady, almost soft, but carrying across the entire pool deck, "my apologies for the reception you received here. There is no excuse." The world held its breath. Sorensen finally lifted her gaze to meet his. Her face, flushed from exertion, was unreadable. She gave the slightest nod. "No apology necessary, Captain." Her tone carried no bitterness, no triumph. "The trainees learned something. That's why I'm here." And just like that, she turned toward the young candidate she'd rescued, now sitting on the edge of the pool, still trembling, medics fussing over him. Her eyes softened slightly, not in victory, but in concern. Her focus was never on humiliation, never on records. It was on the mission, on the people, always. And in that silence, in that simple shift of attention, the real lesson settled deeper than any order could ever teach. What does silence sound like when it's heavy enough to crush a room? On the deck of the Coronado dive facility, it sounded like dripping water. The faint metallic clink of a regulator being unstrapped. The slow hiss of a valve being closed. Every sound magnified because no one else dared move, dared breathe louder than necessary. Lieutenant Commander Maya Sorensen peeled away her gear with the same deliberate calm she'd shown under the water. Gloves off, buckles undone, rebreather set aside. Not hurried, not slow, just precise. As if she'd done it 1,000 times, because she had. The crowd of candidates stood frozen in shame, every mocking laugh they'd offered earlier now echoing back at them like ghosts. Even Callahan, the senior chief whose arrogance had sparked the storm, couldn't find words. His jaw clenched, eyes darting between the clock, the terminal, and the woman he'd dismissed. Captain Elias Thorne broke the silence. "Senior Chief Callahan." The name landed with the weight of judgment. Callahan's spine snapped straight. "Captain." "You and your trainees," Thorne's voice was quiet but it carried like thunder, "have just been given a free lesson. A lesson in humility, a lesson in the danger of assumptions." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut deeper because they were measured, each one deliberate, a blade sliding between armor plates. He let the silence hang before turning back to Sorensen's file still glowing on the monitor. "You assumed she was nothing more than an observer, a staff officer, a tourist. You told her to find her real clothes." His gaze cut toward Callahan, sharp as broken glass. "You asked her to prove she belonged. She already had." The senior chief's face drained of color. The smirk that had once been etched permanently into his features was gone. In its place was something raw, shame. But the humiliation wasn't only his. The candidates shuffled in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground. Their laughter hours ago was now a stain none of them could scrub clean. They hadn't just followed Callahan's lead, they had amplified it. They had chosen arrogance over observation, noise over substance. And now they couldn't look at her. Thorne let the weight settle before reading again from the file, each word deliberate. "Lieutenant Commander Maya Sorensen, Special Activities Division DEVGRU, 5 combat deployments, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, Purple Heart." The medals weren't listed for glory. They were nails in the coffin of arrogance, a litany of sacrifice and service no laughter could erase. The trainees looked at her differently now, awe flickering where mockery once lived. But she didn't acknowledge it. She didn't bask in vindication. She simply continued stripping down her kit, calm as ever, like the entire confrontation had been nothing but background noise. Captain Thorne stepped forward, and in front of everyone, Callahan, the candidates, the instructors, he saluted. It wasn't casual, it wasn't perfunctory, it was reverent, formal, the kind of salute given not to a subordinate but to a peer, to a warrior. The air thickened again. Thorne's voice carried softly but unmistakably, "Lieutenant Commander, my apologies." She met his eyes, steady, gray, unreadable. Her reply was almost whispered, but it carried to every corner of the deck. "No apology necessary, Captain. The trainees learned something. That's why I'm here." Her focus shifted immediately, away from herself, away from vindication, toward the young candidate she had rescued. He sat on the pool's edge, still shivering, medics hovering. She crouched beside him, speaking low, steady words only he could hear, comforting, grounding. In that moment, the lesson crystallized. It wasn't the shattered record that would linger. It wasn't even the medals Thorne had read. It was the way she carried herself when humiliated, the way she carried herself when victorious, and the way she immediately looked after someone else instead of herself. The true measure of strength wasn't noise. It wasn't swagger. It was silent resilience. Callahan finally found his voice. It was low, hoarse, stripped of bravado. "Captain, I." Thorne didn't let him finish. His eyes, cold as steel, cut him down. "You will personally lead the next 3 remedial PT sessions. Each one will begin with you telling your trainees this story, every detail, especially the parts that shame you most." The senior chief swallowed, hard. "You will explain what true competence looks like. You will tell them about the day you mistook one of the Navy's most decorated combat divers for a lost civilian, and you will not forget it." The silence that followed was almost painful. Callahan's shoulders sagged, his entire frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the captain's words. He nodded once, voice barely audible. "Yes, Captain, crystal clear." The story of that day didn't spread through whispers. It detonated. By nightfall, it had reached every corner of the base. The barracks buzzed with it. The mess halls hummed. SEALs, SWCC operators, divers, everyone retold it in hushed voices. Each version added weight, detail, awe, the impossible dive time, the mid-course rescue, the captain's salute, the medals. By morning, it was already legend. The candidates who had laughed felt it burn in their chests, shame that lingered, reshaping them. The instructors who had smirked along with Callahan carried the sting of their own complicity. And Callahan himself, he became the story's unwilling prophet. His remedial PT sessions, once dreaded for their brutality, became infamous for something else: honesty. He stood before new groups of candidates and told them everything: his arrogance, his assumptions, his humiliation. He stripped himself bare, holding up his failure as a mirror for them to see. It wasn't bitterness that carried his voice. It was conviction. He preached a new gospel: the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous. True strength doesn't shout. It doesn't demand, it simply acts. His transformation was so total it shook the culture of Bud S itself. The arrogance that had once been a celebrated part of the filter began to wither. In its place, a new standard grew: humility, awareness, respect for the quiet professional. But Maya Sorensen remained unchanged. She didn't seek the legend, she didn't feed it. When candidates approached her with wide eyes, she listened politely, then redirected them to the work: knot tying, gas mixtures, fin technique. She mentored in small, precise acts of guidance. She never gave speeches. She never reminded anyone of the record she'd shattered. Her philosophy was action, not words. And slowly, without effort, she became something more than a story. She became a symbol, a presence, a living standard for what it meant to be a professional in a world obsessed with noise. The board in the dive locker told the story too. Someone, no one ever admitted, who had written her impossible dive time in permanent marker, adding the initials MS and a tiny trident beside it. The instructors didn't erase it. They let it stand. A monument in ink, a reminder etched into the fabric of the base itself. Every new candidate who saw it asked the question, who was MS? And they were told the story, sometimes by Callahan himself, who now bore his humiliation like a badge of honesty. The Sorensen correction, they called it, a parable of silence, precision, and the cost of arrogance. But for Maya it was just another day, another mission, another lesson taught not by speech but by presence. Because true legacy doesn't come from noise. It comes from the quiet acts that ripple outward, reshaping everything they touch. And she didn't need to speak it, she lived it. How long does it take for a single moment to change a culture? Sometimes not years, sometimes not months, sometimes only a day. At Coronado, the story spread faster than any order ever had. By the end of the week, it wasn't just an incident, it was folklore. The kind whispered in bunks before lights out, the kind repeated over trays in the mess hall, the kind instructors carried in their voices, heavy with meaning. They called it the Sorensen correction. It wasn't just about the record time. It wasn't just about the rescue mid-course. It was about everything leading up to it, the smirks, the mocking, the silence she'd met it all with. And then the transformation, the revelation, the hammer blow of truth. Candidates retold it with awe. Some exaggerated, as stories always do. They swore she moved underwater faster than light itself, that she'd rescued 2 men instead of 1, that she hadn't even broken a sweat. But beneath the myth-making, the core never changed. They had mocked a ghost, and she had reminded them who truly belonged. Even Senior Chief Rex Callahan became its most relentless evangelist. Every remedial PT session began with him telling the story in full. Not once did he soften his own humiliation. He painted himself as the fool, arrogant, blind, loud. He described the way his laughter had turned to silence, the way the clock had betrayed him, the way Captain Thorne's words had cut him down in front of his men. But then his voice would shift, stronger, fiercer. He would tell them what she had taught him. That arrogance is camouflage for fear, that real danger never announces itself, that the quiet professional is the one you should watch most closely. The men listened, not because Callahan shouted, but because his conviction was carved from shame, and shame, when owned, carried power. For the first time in years, his sessions weren't just dreaded, they were transformative. Candidates walked away not just broken in body but humbled in spirit. And Callahan himself, once the loudest gatekeeper, became something else, a mentor forged by failure. The shift rippled outward. Instructors began looking at their own habits, their own assumptions. They saw arrogance differently now, not as toughness but as weakness. They saw silence differently, not as fragility but as strength. The lesson embedded itself into the marrow of Bud S. And through it all, Maya Sorensen walked quietly among them. She never acknowledged the legend, never once brought it up. When approached, she listened, eyes steady, but always turned the conversation back to the work. A candidate struggling with a knot found her kneeling beside him, gray eyes watching, hands demonstrating slowly until his fingers understood. A diver with sloppy fin technique felt her hand rest briefly on his shoulder before she corrected his angle with a simple, efficient motion. No speeches, no theatrics, just presence. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was gravity. People leaned into it, found steadiness in it. The kind of silence that reminded you words weren't the point, competence was. The candidates who had laughed at her in PT gear now avoided her eyes, guilt etched into their posture. But she never punished them, never reminded them of their mistake. She simply held them to the standard, a higher one. And slowly they rose to meet it. One night in the quiet of the barracks, a trainee stared at the dive record board. The numbers burned into his mind. 2 minutes faster, a lifetime faster. Beside the digits, someone had scrawled her initials, MS, and drawn a crude little trident. It should have been erased, but it was. No one touched it, not the instructors, not the officers, not even Callahan. It stayed a permanent monument in marker. Every class that passed through saw it. Every class asked the story, and every time someone told it. The legend lived because it was useful, because it reminded them that the world doesn't care how loud you are, how broad your chest, how sharp your smirk. The world only cares if you can act when it matters. Weeks passed. Maya remained unchanged. She didn't seek attention. She didn't bask. She evaluated training, adjusted protocols, scribbled notes in her calm, precise handwriting. She was there not to build her own reputation but to sharpen theirs. Yet her presence was felt in ways she never acknowledged. The atmosphere at the pool deck grew quieter. The arrogance that once hung in the air thinned. Candidates whispered less, focused more. Instructors caught themselves before mocking. Something had shifted. And Callahan, once the embodiment of loud, gatekeeping arrogance, was the clearest sign. He carried the weight of his failure openly now. He wore it like armor. He told the story again and again, not because he was ordered, but because he believed it mattered. His voice no longer dripped with sarcasm. It carried honesty, conviction. When he pointed at the initials on the record board, his finger didn't tremble with resentment. It steadied with respect. She never raised her voice, he told the next class, eyes scanning their tired faces. She never had to. Her actions spoke louder than all the noise we made. The young men listened, silent. For many of them, this was the first time they truly understood what it meant to be a SEAL. Not the Hollywood version, not the swaggering myth, but the quiet truth, professionalism so absolute it required no announcement. Maya didn't know, or didn't care, that her legend was reshaping the culture around her. She simply showed up every day, gray eyes steady, hair tied back, presence sharp as a blade sheathed in calm. It wasn't the noise that endured, it was the silence. Because sometimes, the most powerful correction doesn't come in shouted orders or slammed fists. It comes in the quiet dismantling of arrogance, the way silence can strip pride to its bones. And the Sorensen correction had done exactly that. How do you measure a shadow after it's gone? At Coronado, the shadow she left didn't fade, it grew. Weeks had passed since the day at the dive tank. Yet every time a candidate tied his boots, every time an instructor barked an order, every time Callahan raised his voice to tell the story, her presence lingered. She didn't demand it. She didn't cultivate it. She simply was. Lieutenant Commander Maya Sorensen moved through those weeks the same way she had moved through the Serpent's tooth, calm, precise, silent. She sat at briefings, pencil steady in her hand, scribbling notes no one else could read. She walked the grinder with a gaze that never lingered too long but never missed a detail. She watched candidates in the surf, their faces blue from cold, and said little. But when she finally spoke, a single correction, a simple observation, it cut through exhaustion and landed with more weight than an hour of shouting. Because she didn't waste words. Candidates began to seek her out quietly, not for speeches, not for praise, for clarity, a knot they couldn't quite master, a gear adjustment that never sat right, a breathing rhythm that faltered in the surf. She gave them exactly what they needed, no more, no less, a demonstration, a short phrase, a look, and then she was gone as if the problem had never existed. It was unnerving at first how she seemed to appear exactly when needed, but slowly it became steadying. Her silence wasn't distance, it was gravity. It pulled them into sharper focus. Even Callahan, once the loudest man on the deck, carried himself differently now. His booming sarcasm had softened into a rough-edged humility. He still barked, still pushed, still drove the men to the edge. But between the noise came moments of stillness, lessons folded into reflection. He admitted things he never would have months before. Admitted fear. Admitted failure. admitted that arrogance had nearly blinded him to what true strength looked like. It wasn't weakness, it was growth. The legend of Maya Sorensen of the day she silenced the loudest man on base traveled beyond Coronado. Stories moved faster than orders. Operators downrange, still deployed in deserts and seas, began to hear whispers. Some didn't believe it at first. A staff officer, a logistician, impossible. Until someone who had been there shook their head and swore on their trident. I saw it, with my own eyes. And the story grew. It wasn't just the dive record, it wasn't even the rescue. It was the silence. The way she hadn't fought humiliation with anger. The way she hadn't claimed victory with triumph. The way she had treated both impostors, ridicule and respect, with the same calm neutrality. That silence spoke louder than anything else. On the dive locker board, the marker-etched initials MS became more than ink. They became a ritual. Every new class that arrived was shown the numbers. Every class asked the story. And every time someone, often Callahan himself, told it. He told it without softening the humiliation. He told it as if it were scripture, the moment that changed him. He pointed at the initials, voice rough but steady, and said, "Remember this. The most dangerous person in the room is never the one making the most noise." The young men listened. But Maya, she deflected every attempt at reverence. One evening, a candidate stammered a question. "Ma'am, what was it like breaking that record?" Her gray eyes lingered on him, unreadable, before she answered with a single word. "Irrelevant." The boy blinked, confused. She didn't elaborate. She simply pointed at his knotwork and corrected the angle of his wrist. That was her truth. Records didn't matter. Legends didn't matter. The mission mattered. The next skill, the next task, the next operator prepared for the battlefield. She was a soldier, not a story. But stories don't ask permission to grow. By the time her assignment neared its end, the culture at Coronado had already begun to shift. The loudness that once defined the grinder softened. The mockery that once bonded candidates weakened. In its place grew something sharper, heavier. A new respect, a new awareness. Arrogance had become a liability. Silence had become a strength. The irony was that Maya never acknowledged it. She remained the same. She showed up early, evaluated protocols, scribbled her notes, corrected quietly. And then one day she was gone. No ceremony, no farewell, no salute at the gate. She vanished the way she lived, silently. One morning she was there, gray eyes tracking candidates in the surf. The next she was, her assignment complete. Her skills needed elsewhere in some undisclosed corner of the world no one would ever hear about. But her presence lingered. It lingered in the way candidates tied their knots with precision, in the way Callahan's voice carried humility beneath the bark, in the way instructors caught themselves before mocking a recruit, remembering the sting of their own laughter. It lingered in the initials on the board. And it lingered most in the silence, no longer awkward, no longer empty, but charged with meaning. A silence that reminded everyone that true strength doesn't shout, it simply acts. Because legacy isn't always the medals on your chest or the records in the books. Sometimes it's the ripple you leave behind in others, the correction of arrogance, the recalibration of pride, the echo of silence that teaches louder than words ever could. That was the Sorensen correction. And it was only the beginning. What happens to a place when the ghost it fears and respects finally leaves? At Coronado, the air felt different. It wasn't dramatic. No one rang bells, no flags dipped in salute. She was simply gone. One day she stood at the edge of the pool, pencil in hand, hair pulled tight in that simple ponytail, eyes like gray steel over the water. The next day her locker was empty, her cot in the visiting officer's quarters stripped bare. There was no goodbye, no explanation, no closure. Lieutenant Commander Maya Sorensen had vanished as quietly as she had arrived, carried off to whatever dark corner of the world demanded her particular skill set. but absence is its own presence. The candidates felt it first. The silence that had once unsettled them now weighed heavier because it was gone. They looked for her gray eyes in the observation deck and found only empty space. They half expected her voice to cut through their exhaustion with a precise correction, but it never came. In her absence, their mistakes stung more sharply. They realized they had depended on her presence more than they'd known. The instructors felt it too. They were left holding the echo of her standard, a shadow they had to live up to. And though none admitted it out loud, they feared falling back into old habits, the arrogance, the dismissive laughter, the blind pride that had nearly poisoned them all. Callahan felt it most. He stood on the grinder at dawn, boots sinking into wet asphalt, candidates shivering before him. His voice carried, but behind it was the memory of the silence that had humbled him. The woman who had dismantled him with nothing more than patience and precision. He could never undo that humiliation, but he could honor it. So he told the story again. Again and again. The Sorensen correction became his creed. He told it not because Captain Thorne had ordered him to, but because he couldn't imagine leading without it. He described the smirk he wore that day, the way his words dripped with arrogance. He painted the picture of laughter echoing across the pool deck, of a woman standing still in oversized PT gear. And then he described what happened when silence finally answered. He didn't soften the edges, he didn't protect his pride, he bared it raw. And in doing so, he found freedom. The candidates listened, really listened, because his shame was honest, because his conviction was real, because the initials on the record board, still scrawled in marker, bore witness to every word he spoke. But Captain Thorne knew stories alone weren't enough. He moved quietly, deliberately, embedding her lesson deeper than myth. He gathered the instructors in the briefing room and pulled up the security footage from that day, the locker door slamming open, the gear revealed, the methodical preparation, the impossible dive. He froze the frame at her nod before entering the water. He replayed the rescue of the panicked trainee. He let the silence of the room soak in her impossible record time. Then he spoke. This is not just a story. It's a case study. It's doctrine. It is proof that arrogance blinds. It is proof that competence wears no uniform you can recognize from a distance. And it is proof that respect is earned not with noise but with action. The instructors shifted, some uneasy, some convicted. Thorne's voice grew firmer. From this day forward, the Sorensen correction is mandatory in instructor training. Every new leader who sets foot on this base will study it, not for her medals, not for her record, but for her silence, for what it cost us not to see her for who she was. And so the legend became more than whispers. It became curriculum. A binder was printed, Instructor Leadership Protocols. Within it, underlined in bold, was a section, Case Study, the Sorensen Correction. Inside were the transcripts, the security stills, and Captain Thorne's own reflections. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was law. Months passed. The new culture began to take root. The arrogance that once filled the grinder like smog thinned. Not gone, never gone, but tempered. Candidates carried themselves differently. Instructors watched their own words more carefully. And Callahan, once the symbol of the old way, was now the loudest preacher of the new. Late one evening, a class of candidates sat huddled around a table in the mess. One of them pointed at the initials on the board earlier that day and whispered, "Do you think she really did it that fast?" Another shook his head. "Doesn't matter if she did it faster, she did it calmer, that's the point." They fell silent, realizing they just answered their own question. And that was the quiet brilliance of her legacy. It forced them to reflect, to question, to recalibrate their understanding of strength. Because strength wasn't the shout, it wasn't the swagger, it wasn't the smirk. Strength was silence under fire. Strength was calm under humiliation. Strength was professionalism so deep it didn't require acknowledgement. Strength was Maya Sorensen. Even though she was gone, her absence became a mirror, a test. Could they uphold the standard without her presence? Could they carry the silence forward when the noise of arrogance tried to creep back in? Some nights Callahan sat alone in his office, staring at the trident pinned to his wall. He thought about the way she had looked at him after surfacing from the serpent's tooth, not with anger, not with triumph, but with calm. The calm of someone who had nothing to prove, and yet had proven everything. That look haunted him, but it also steadied him. He had been broken by her silence, and in that breaking, he had found the only thing worth teaching. By the time the next class began Hell Week, the Sorensen correction wasn't just a lesson, it was a ritual. Before the surf torture, before the log carries, before the endless drown-proofing drills, Callahan gathered them on the deck, pointed at the initials, and told the story again. And every time, his voice broke slightly at the same part, not when she shattered the record, not when she surfaced, not even when Captain Thorne saluted her, but when she turned from triumph to tend to the boy she had saved. That was the moment that mattered most. That was the moment that taught him strength had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with service. The trainees saw his conviction. They felt the weight of the silence she left behind, and whether they admitted it or not, they carried it into the water. Because even ghosts can shape the living. How far can a single lesson travel? At first, the Sorensen correction belonged to Coronado, a story whispered in barracks, etched into the dive board, carried in Callahan's rough voice during PT. But legends never stay confined. They move. They find cracks in walls, slip through doors, cross oceans. Within months, her story had left the base. Instructors rotated to new commands. Candidates graduated, carrying the tale like contraband in their duffels. A young SEAL in the fleet mentioned it during a deployment briefing, and the room fell silent as he described the woman in PT gear who had dismantled arrogance without raising her voice. It reached East Coast teams. It reached instructors at Dam Neck. It reached divers in Guam, operators in Djibouti, advisors in South America. Each time it was told, the edges blurred but the center held. She was always the same, quiet, precise, professional. And the lesson was always the same: never assume. Never mistake silence for weakness. The Sorensen correction began to appear in places no one expected. A slide in a leadership course, a bullet point in a training doctrine, a whispered phrase passed between operators when someone new walked into the room. Check yourself, don't forget the correction. It became shorthand, a way of saying don't be arrogant, pay attention, respect competence. Somewhere along the way, Captain Thorne began using it as a case study in his lectures to senior instructors. He would dim the lights, play the footage from that day. Sorensen opening her locker, revealing the gear, suiting up with perfect efficiency. He would let it play without commentary until the moment she surfaced, clock shattered, silence absolute. Then he would ask the room one question. What did you miss? The instructors always shifted uncomfortably. Some muttered about her stance, her calm, her preparation. Thorne would nod, then drive the knife deeper. You missed her, you assumed, just like Callahan, just like his trainees. You chose arrogance over observation, and arrogance kills. No one left those sessions unchanged. But the story didn't just shape doctrine, it shaped people. A candidate who once mocked a smaller teammate bit his tongue, remembering how silence had cut deeper than laughter. A young instructor who prided himself on sarcasm softened his edges, realizing his words could blind more than they sharpened. And Callahan, forever haunted by that day, became living proof that humiliation can forge a man sharper than pride ever could. He carried the Sorensen correction into everything he did. When a trainee stumbled, he didn't sneer. He steadied. When a candidate failed, he didn't mock. He reminded them that failure, when faced honestly, is the only path to competence. He wasn't soft, he was harder than ever, but his hardness carried honesty, not arrogance. And the men respected him more for it. One evening, after another punishing day of surf torture, a trainee whispered to his classmate as they shivered in their cots, "Do you think she knows that her story still being told?" The other shook his head. "Doesn't matter, she didn't do it for that." And maybe that was the secret. The legend grew precisely because she hadn't asked it to, because she hadn't defended herself with noise or claimed victory with pride. She had just been herself, calm, precise, focused on the mission. It was the purity of that silence that made the story indestructible. By the time a year had passed, the Sorensen correction had become required reading for new instructor candidates. Captain Thorne insisted on it. Security stills from the dive tank were included in binders. Callahan himself sometimes appeared in person, grizzled, blunt, voice rough with conviction, to tell the story again. He never tired of telling it, because every retelling freed him a little more from the arrogance that had once owned him. And everywhere it spread, it carried the same moral reflection, spoken in different voices but always meaning the same. Strength isn't noise, it isn't swagger, it isn't arrogance. Strength is silence. Strength is precision. Strength is the professional who doesn't need to announce themselves, because when the time comes, their actions speak louder than any voice. The initials stayed on the dive board, faded, smudged, but still visible. MS. Candidates pointed at it like a relic. Instructors nodded toward it before drills. It became ritual, tradition. And still, somewhere in the world, Maya Sorensen moved unseen, serving in ways no one would ever write about. Missions unnamed, operations undisclosed, her legend teaching louder than any official report ever could. Because true legacy doesn't live in records, it lives in echoes. And her echo was everywhere. How long can a single silence echo? At Coronado, it had been a year. A new class stood shivering on the edge of the pool, faces pale in the floodlights, the Serpent's tooth yawning dark beneath the water. Fear hung heavy in the air, the kind that smelled like chlorine and salt, sweat and doubt. Senior Chief Rex Callahan stood before them. His face was older now. The arrogance once carved into his jawline had been worn away, replaced by something harder, cleaner. Humility etched in lines around his eyes. He raised a calloused finger and pointed at the dive board. The initials, MS, faded but still visible, stared back at the class like a challenge. "Before we begin," his voice rumbled, steady but low, "you're going to hear a story." The candidates glanced at one another, unsure if this was another test, another way to break them. But Callahan's gaze didn't waver. He told them everything. Not just the record, not just the rescue. He told them about himself, the sneer, the sarcasm, the arrogance that had blinded him. He told them about the laughter that had spilled from their predecessors, about the silence that answered it, about the locker door that opened not on weakness but on truth. He described the impossible calm, the methodical preparation, the way she slid through the water like part of it. He described the young man who had nearly drowned, and how she had steadied him with one hand and saved him without hesitation. He described the moment she surfaced, clock annihilated, silence absolute. And then he told them the part that mattered most. She didn't look at us, she didn't gloat, she didn't demand respect. She walked past us all and went straight to the boy she saved, because for her it was never about proving anything. It was about the mission, about each other. The pool deck was silent. Callahan let it hang, his voice roughening. "You want to know what strength looks like? It looks like that. It's not loud. It's not arrogant. It doesn't need to tell you how tough it is. Real strength is calm, professional, precise. And when you meet it, you'll know, because it won't have to say a damn thing." The young men stared at him, the weight of his words heavier than any log they had carried. "Remember this," he finished, pointing again at the board. "True legacy isn't noise. It's not bragging. It's not swagger. True legacy is what you leave in others. That's what she left in me. and now I'm leaving it with you." No one spoke, no one laughed. The silence itself became part of the ritual. That night, as they filed into the freezing water, some carried fear, some carried determination. All carried the echo of a woman most of them would never meet. A woman who had turned humiliation into doctrine, arrogance into humility, silence into a weapon sharper than any blade. Maya Sorensen was nowhere near Coronado. She was likely half a world away, slipping into dark water, unseen, unknown. She had no idea her name had become myth, no idea her silence had reshaped a culture, no idea her initials on a record board had become a monument. But maybe that was fitting. Because legacy isn't something you chase. It isn't something you announce. It isn't something you demand. Legacy is what lingers when you've left. It's the silence that stays after the laughter dies. It's the lesson carved into the bones of men who once thought they understood strength. It's the humility etched into a senior chief who will spend the rest of his career telling a story about the day he was wrong. Sometimes, legacy is nothing more than a silence that refuses to fade. The Sorensen correction lived on, not in medals, not in records, not in her own voice, but in the stories told by others, in the initials written on a board, in the quiet professionalism demanded of every man who dared step into the grinder. And in the end, it carried a truth so sharp, so undeniable it didn't need embellishment. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And its echo is eternal.